Hi, folks. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good night, depending on which time zone you're in. My name is Jeff Everhart, and the title of my presentation today is Telling Geospatial Stories with WordPress. And I figured I'd get started by just kind of giving you a little bit of background about me and what I've been doing with WordPress over the last decade or so. I'm a web and application developer working currently for a group at Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, called the Alt Lab, which is short for Academic Learning Transformation Lab. Before that, I have kind of an eclectic background, and I started my education to be an English teacher. So I've taught a lot of college classes online and face-to-face in English and liberal studies and things like that, and worked for a good amount of time as an educational technologist before kind of making this transition into web application development. My pronouns are he, his, and him. In terms of my technical abilities and skills, I really like working in a lot of different programming environments, and I really enjoy picking up whatever's needed to accomplish a particular task. So just because this list is here, if you check out my website or anything like that, you'll see a fairly eclectic collection of projects which border on what we're talking about today, with a lot of geospatial stuff, you know, some systems development, and then everything out into like making chatbots and stuff using Amazon Web Services, and doing natural language processing using JavaScript or Python. But what I really enjoy working with is I'm definitely a JavaScript junkie. So if I had a preference, it's certainly that. I've been working with WordPress since about 2011, doing theme and plugin development and using that as the basis to create a lot of really interesting educational tools, some of which you'll see today. And then I'm also a big fan of Google Apps Script. VCU happens to be a Google Cloud school. So we use Google Apps Script to automate lots of really cool stuff as a part of our job. My other developer street creds, I had to include in here that I've blown up at least one server using the rm-rf command. So I paid the blood price, if you will. If you are interested in finding out any more about me or following my work, there's two great ways to do that. I have a blog that I post stuff to fairly regularly, jeffreyeverhart.com, and then I tweet about all this stuff at J_Everhart383. So I do want to kind of give a little bit of background on my team, since a lot of what I'm going to be showing you today is the process of this larger team that I work on, this Alt Lab R&D team. And we are in a really interesting position that I enjoy very much, having been in the higher ed field for going on a decade now. But we're part of a larger team of instructional designers, media specialists, and then online learning administrators. And the subset of that group that I work with, Alt Lab R&D, is 3 people, including myself. So we're a fairly small team. We get the benefit of doing a lot of really cool ed tech development, and we're often brought in to assess problems, build out automations for people. So we're in the process of transitioning to Canvas, and we're using that API to build out a lot of helpful tools to help us build courses at scale. So a lot of really cool and interesting projects. We run and support something called Rampages, which is a WordPress multi-site installation that is at this point somewhere a little bit over 30,000 sites on there. We're about 30,000 users as well, not all of them active, but a very large multi-site installation that tends to take up a lot of our support time. On the little Alt Lab R&D team, we have a variety of systems admin, web development, and design capabilities. So we're a very well-rounded group of folks, and we complement each other very well. And as such, I think we're able to produce some kind of cool work. To do that, we automate all of the boring parts of our job using Google Apps Script, and so that's a whole talk in and of itself that maybe I'd love to give at some point, but it's worth checking out if you haven't. And so again, we are small but mighty, and as a result, we have to support everything we build or add to Rampages. So I felt like before I jumped into stuff, I just kind of needed to give a disclaimer about it. So I'm going to go ahead and raise my hand. Who else here is burnt out from the last 6 months? I'm raising my hand between juggling small children and trying to get the essential work that we needed to get done. When I submitted this presentation, I had much higher hopes for where some of these things would be in terms of polish than what they are today. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm trying to be kind to myself and saying, hey, you've been dealing with a global pandemic and a university of 30,000 people moving online. You know, it's very understandable that you didn't follow through with some of these 10% time projects that are super fun and interesting. But I think my goal with that is to use this opportunity as a way of getting feedback from the community before we've gone too far in some of these directions, and see, hey, what do you all think of this, or these things that you might use with your faculty or with your students, or where could you see potential problems or ways that we might take this in a different direction. So I'm really interested in whatever Q&A you all have, and I'll try and leave a little bit of time at the end to do that. So we'll jump in and kind of just get started. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to was because over the last several years at VCU, we've been pulled into a lot of conversations with faculty who are interested in designing courses or research products that contain some sort of geospatial component. And I think when I say geospatial, I just mean that. I mean, we have some sort of geographic data and then some sort of attribute data about those varying geographical levels that we want to display or interact with in a different or interesting way. And so at about 2016, when we really first started tackling and getting some of these requests, I say in the beginning there was D3. And that was the method that we kind of used to create some of these interactive and geospatial components outside of WordPress. And because it was outside of WordPress and because everything was in D3, which is, in my opinion, a fairly bare bones type of visualization library, it took us a lot of time, and these things became really time consuming to build. Finding and cleaning all of the data was often really difficult to do. And then we also kind of wanted to say, and our goal, our larger goal as a part of Alt Lab is to recognize the different patterns that faculty request across our group, and to kind of build tools that suit multiple faculty needs, and that they build things that they can go and use on their own and don't need me to build for them. And so I want to just take a quick look at a couple of different examples that we built in early 2016. So we have a density map that we were asked to build for a particular class, so they could kind of look at all of the different population densities across Virginia counties. And then another one that we had to do is look at VCU, where we decided to analyze some CDC data and create a map of death rates by each state. And one of the things that we did here was we included all of these different statistical filters and color scale filters to help illuminate the process that goes into creating a geographic data visualization. Most people see a map and they don't necessarily analyze that this was a process that somebody used to come up with a particular result. So if I have me visualizing total deaths is something very different than visualizing deaths per 100K residents. And so if we're trying to tell stories with geographical data, as we so often want to do as a part of assignments or as a part of faculty research, these distinctions are important, and they're things that we want our students to think about as they approach data visualizations as both producers and consumers, right? There are choices that go into this process that we make as the creator that impact the way that somebody's going to view this story or the way that it's going to fit a particular narrative. So we read a really great book about the opioid epidemic as and then created this resource as a supplemental. Teachers could use this to engage their students in those discussions about what's the difference between an age-adjusted death rate or deaths per 100K residents, or total deaths versus deaths per 100K residents. Because we see here, looks like the situation's really bad in California, when in reality, when we provide a different statistical filter, we get a different result. Same thing with how we choose to represent those colors. If we choose different scales, we get different results. And again, it was really about bringing to light some of the choices that get made behind the scenes as people create geographical or geospatial visualizations. Now, the problem with that, this took a ton of time for me to produce because, one, I was responsible for going and finding the data, cleaning the data, joining the geographical data with the statistical data from the CDC, and then obviously making it into this nice visualization interactive that you see here. So throughout the process, we've always ways that we can do this. And as you'll see here in a second, that's what has brought us to trying to use WordPress to make some of this a little bit more repeatable and take some of the work off of our team, and again, make those tools easier for people to interact with. So like I mentioned just a second ago, our thought pattern is after we interact with faculty and we observe a bunch of repeating requests or requests that are 85% or 75% similar, then we say, okay, as a team, look, we've had 3 or 4 people ask for a way to collect or annotate geospatial data, or we've had 3 or 4 people ask for ways that we could help them make maps that would support a written narrative of some kind. And then we also found that as we were building these things, a lot of the people at VCU in particular were an urban R1 institution. They're very much focused on using the Richmond metro area and Virginia as a whole as an exploratory space for their courses. And so hopefully you'll see those in a couple of the examples that I have coming. And so these were kind of the high level things that we identified. Hey, we need to build something to make it easier for people to collect and annotate geospatial data. And then we need to also build something that will help them create arguments based that are supported by maps or other visualizations like the one you just saw. So let's take a look at a couple of these people collect and annotate data. And again, these are some homegrown tools, and what our general development process is it's really iterative. And so we like to build out our initial prototypes using the simplest tools possible before we invest in developing a larger theme or perhaps plugin that might be drop-in ready. And so the first one we'll look at is this bicycle urbanism course. And so this was created for a course called Bicycle Urbanism. In 2015, there was a giant bike race in the area that shut down a lot of downtown Richmond for the students. And so there was a lot of interest in this and a lot of themed courses based on that. And so what this type of scenario allowed them to do was essentially they had the students in the course explore the Richmond area to document and then map those on this document so that we could see, all right, where are the bicycling conditions good, where are they dangerous, and so on and so forth. And so we've got this nice color-coded map here. I'll try and zoom in a little bit, where clearly the red obviously indicates some sort of unsafe bicycle condition, and the green indicates a good one, and same with the blue here, where this is, that's okay. And so it's a really interesting assignment for the students because one, they get to undergo the process of exploring the larger Richmond metro environment to collect this data, but then they also get pulled into discussions about what are that go into changing something like this. And there were a number of these unsafe bicycle conditions that when the students followed through on them and officials that they were actually addressed. So it's a really interesting way to get the students out involved in a real world environment and then have them enact some sort of real change based on what they're doing in a course. And so what we did here is if you come to this submit info thing, it just kind of says send us to another page. And it's basically this current latitude and longitude that then gets passed in this URL parameter and then just gets sucked up into a regular gravity form. And then when we submit mapping results page. So again, in terms of development time, not a ton of time invested into this. This is really the kind of lowest common denominator. We're using a gravity form to do this submission. We're using part of that plugin to show these mapping results. So a really interesting project with fairly low overhead in terms of turnaround time on making this. Now the problem is once somebody sees this, they want it, somebody else wants it, but they want it a little bit different, or they want something that's a little bit more customized. And so that's where we kind of get into once we see repeat patterns like this happen, where we'll say, okay, now let's take 75 or 85% of this, build a more robust solution that we can just drop into somebody's course site, and then they can kind of be off running. And if we need to do visual customizations like some CSS or something, we can handle that in a one-off situation using kind of the built-in appearance tools. That is the result of that double down investment into a more robust theme. And so this course was called Social Justice in the City. And this was focused on gentrification. And so the students were, again, asked to explore the Richmond metro area and looking for particular instances of gentrification, right? Are we seeing yoga studios and Starbucks pop up next to, barbershops or ethnic grocery stores? And like, what does that relationship look like when we talk with the residents who are being gentrified, and how do they perceive that? And so, again, this is very similar, but we've actually, now that this is a drag and drop, and we chose to actually build this as a theme instead of a plugin. And I'm happy to field questions on why we did that later. But the short answer is really, if anybody's familiar with the term SPLOT, which is simplest possible learning online tool, we kind of follow that methodology where this is a thing. If you want to build another site that has a different look and feel, that's fine. But this is a tool in and of itself, and we drop the theme in there. It automatically generates the pages that it needs to function. And it's kind of a self-contained thing where it's not really meant to be modified. So that's kind of why we decided to go that route instead of a plugin. But eventually I'm sure somebody will ask me that in the Q&A, and I'm happy to explain that further. But this one, works fairly similarly. It's got this method of adding point, and if I wait just a second, it should geolocate me, and then I can add a map point and give it a title. It allows the faculty member to just generate some categories for this custom post type that would show up on this left-hand side if they wanted more of them. And we can add an image to our thing and add a description of the particular point and then submit it. It also allows geolocation thing, and if I wanted to manually select a point in space, I could do that as well. But we did a lot of stuff to build out a couple of different views for this. So obviously we have this categorized view on the left-hand side that we can filter by, and a lot of these stuff, if we want to click read this page, and these particular students actually did a lot of media production, where they went out and kind of interviewed people in the community who were in neighborhoods that were experiencing gentrification and edited some podcasts and included them here. So it was a really interesting way for us to create a tool that could not only capture this geospatial data, but because it's just WordPress and because this is just a WordPress post, it also handles whatever kind of media that they want to throw at it. So you want to include a video, do you want to include a podcast? It gave the instructor a lot of flexibility in how they wanted the students to tackle these different interviews and represent them however they thought it was kind of best. So we've got that piece. If we look at the points, that's obviously just going to give us a list of all of them. The instructor asked us to do was to create essentially different layers of this stuff. So she was like a heat map so the students could look at where they spend most of their time. And there was a category that was removed for privacy reasons where they essentially logged all of their common places. Where do they eat lunch? Where do they go to classes? Where do they hang out after their classes? Things like that, so that they could kind of visualize this heat map and see where they spent most of their time in comparison to some of these gentrified areas. So that was fairly easy to do using kind of just a leaflet add-on, which was another nice thing that was, again, a customization that somebody said, hey, this would be really neat if we could do this. And since we'd already had the bones of this built, it was fairly easy for us to come in and say, all right, I'm going to click this button and we'll show this heat map. And it's also worth mentioning that I'm actually an administrator of the site, so I see everybody's posts and everybody's map points, but the students would only see theirs, so that when they were viewing this heat map, they were only viewing their own stuff. So let's hop out of that. And so again, those are some examples of what we've done to kind of build, collect, and annotate data. And since that, we've had a lot of people use that, the theme that we just looked at, for a lot of varying purposes. Now that we are at the end of the spring semester, when everybody kind of went remote, and obviously VCU being an urban school, we had people from wide-ranging areas, right? In Virginia, obviously out of state. And so a lot of people said, hey, I want a way to kind of like see where everybody's at. And we use that mapping tool so that everybody could kind of like, oh, let's create a map of everybody in the course. Where are they at? Where are they taking their coursework for the rest of the semester? So it was a way that, they were also able to kind of do some interesting things that we didn't plan on, which is kind of neat. So once you invest in building a tool like that, I'm interested in how often people co-opt it for a purpose other than what I anticipated, which is always really, really rewarding to see as an educational technologist. So from here, we'll hop into some examples of how we've used maps to support. And so I'll give a little background on this project. And this actually doesn't have to do with WordPress, but this was just an initial, like I said before, our development process usually starts with us creating the lowest fidelity kind of prototype that we can to just test it, make sure it's what people want before we invest time in building that out into a more comprehensive solution. And so what we were tasked with here is we were working with a group of student and faculty researchers who were studying the migratory patterns of the prothomitary warbler. Okay, and so that's a mouthful, but this is a very important bird that migrates from North America down to a particular mangrove ecosystem in Panama. And over the last 10 years, that mangrove system has been destroyed in various ways through urbanization. And so this, as a predictor of global warming, this thing is a very important bird, especially in the opinion of these researchers. And so what we were messing around with was, is there ways that we could, pair this narrative about the bird's journey from North America to Central and South America and kind of pair some narrative text with a visualization of that migration pattern. And it's really important because as things have gotten warmer and as seasons have changed on both sides of the equator, it really messes up the bird's migration pattern because they arrive in Mexico expecting it to be spring and expecting lots of larvae to eat, but that's not necessarily there. So it's really throwing a lot of things for a loop. And so this is just a really simple pen that does kind of exactly what I said, where we've got some narrative text up here. And as we kind of scroll, we draw this line on the map down, and eventually, we follow that bird's migration pattern on down to Panama. And so nothing super serious, because again, this was like we just want to see how could we do this? Would this be a nice way to represent it? And we built using a library called the Lama JavaScript library, which is created by the group at The Pudding, which The Pudding is a fantastic website, especially if you're into bespoke data visualizations. They do a fantastic job. So I definitely recommend it. If you get nothing else from this presentation, you think I'm a total idiot, go look at The Pudding, because they're far better at this stuff than I am, or we are. But this Llama library is fantastic because what it allows you to do is this what they call this scrolly telling story type. So we've got that we scroll through, and as we scroll through it, we can an intersection observer to trigger different functions to run in our code. And so the nice thing about that is it's totally agnostic. And so some of the examples that they give you down below in this tutorial are using the D3 library. So you could use it with D3, you could use it with Leaflet, as I've done. It's really up to you to determine what is it that I'm trying what change am I trying to elicit in my visualization? What libraries do I want to use to do that? And there are no real restrictions other than how you have to set up the HTML markup to create these different sections that then get triggered as they enter or exit the viewport. And so we can see that, I can also go forward in time and then go backward. And so we thought this was one. I don't think we ended up actually using this for this particular project, but we said, hey, there's enough here that we should probably really think about what it would take to make this more robust. And I'm going to switch into the code view for just a second. And I'm not going to look at a ton of code today, but this is, I think, worth showing. Because what ends up happening is like really easy to make. I mean, I think I did this thing in like 2 or 3 hours. But again, when you look at how we had to build it, we see a bunch of hard-coded data in here for those particular waypoints. And really, when we talk about maintainability, being a web development team of 3 people trying to support, a a large faculty base and a large student base, we were like, no, this can't be something that we make bespoke every time. There needs to be a way that we manage this data somehow, and that's really where kind of WordPress stepped in for us when we looked at how do we start managing this geospatial data in a way that makes it easy for somebody else to do and doesn't require a programmer to sit here and create this JSON array of these different locations. So we'll hop back into and then we'll take a look at what it took to make this thing configurable. So what we did is fork that first theme that I showed you and co-opted that to provide a more scrolly telling-like experience instead of one where we actually added in particular data from the geolocation. Like, we're not collecting data. This is something that a researcher or students would have already compiled somewhere. And then now we just want to make it interactive. We want to combine a map visualization with a narrative and then make those narrative sections trigger different changes on the map based on the data that we associate with them. And then so the project that we really used to kind of kick off that was one called Mapping Black Religion by a colleague who is actually former VCU. She is now at Yale. Nicole Turner was writing a book called Soul Liberty, The Evolution of Black Religious Politics in Post-Emancipation Virginia, and did a ton of primary research and digging through these old convention records to find to tabulate vote tallies and all of this really interesting stuff that just begs to be displayed on a map. So let's see if I can find where that's at. I don't think we need these D3 things. I'm just going to do some tab maintenance up here with that. Scroll Llama, see you later. Okay. And so that led us to this Mapping Black Religion site. And so again, you can see we stole some of the design elements, and I literally just kind of forked the other theme that we were looking at and made some changes to this to do what we want to do, is to create that scrolly telling experience. The process for managing this geographical data, sadly, was still really involved, particularly because of the constraints of Nicole's research. So we were looking at that post-emancipation period, so 1860s to 1870s. So we had to go find historical shape files for the Virginia county and do a bunch of black magic and ArcGIS to get that into GeoJSON, and then combine that with the spreadsheet of her stuff. So there was still a lot of really manual data massaging that had to happen before we could build this thing that I'm not sure what the best way to approach is. And so clearly, obviously, we're using professional level tools like ArcGIS to generate. But I'm really also interested in looking towards the future of how could we build similar tools or similar management system into the WordPress backend that would allow us to do a little bit of that data management, and especially make it easier for Nicole, since that was really something that she had to kind of pass off to me to do, and it was my responsibility to, like, all right, I'm going to get this GeoJSON and then combine it with this other stuff to get something that we can actually visualize. And so this is really interesting. So we've got this nice narrative that, and then as we kind of step through these sections, it will changes on the map based on where we are, and automatically restyle this GeoJSON layer. And we can add points that have additional description. You know, obviously it's styling these different polygons and generating these different kind of on the fly based on how we configure stuff in the WordPress backend. And I'll kind of show you all what that looks like here in just a second. Let me hop back over here. And I hope we're going to close out. No, yep, here we go. And so this is an example. This was kind of our test site that we were building. And so what we ended up doing is creating a series of custom post types. Some of them we're not using currently, but I think, again, the hope is that we have this narrative section that we're using to create the narrative. And then down here we have a series of advanced custom fields that we've created to essentially help the user process those map transitions. So if we have a GeoJSON file in it, we can essentially data bind to that particular, whatever attribute field or property is on that GeoJSON feature. And then we have a legend alias. We can specify what color we want the particular polygon to be filled as with some pattern options like opacity, border color pattern, so that the author of this thing can really kind of make that what they want without having to interact with a web developer. In addition to that, we can also come down here and process transitions on the map itself. So zooming and panning or changing the focus latitude. In this example, since we were looking at the whole state of Virginia, this is just kind of a default view, but we could be doing things like panning from, Spotsylvania County in Virginia to Richmond City, or whatever we wanted to do based on the particular transition from one narrative section to another. Then it also gives us the ability to throw a title in there so that each thing has a little bit of an additional context as you're scrolling through it, and then has the ability for the author to add in these different points that then appear at the map with this sometimes rich text right here. So a lot of customization ability in terms of letting the faculty kind of take the lead from there. And that seemed to work out well for us. Again, I think our long-term goal was to be able to do a little bit more of the editing of the geographical data inside of WordPress, but that's a tricky thing to do, number one. And I'd really be interested to hear, have people done that before? Especially when we're talking about polygons and attribute data and things like that. It can certainly get tricky. Where a location, like a point location, probably isn't too tough, right? We've got a description that's the post body, and then some custom fields for a latitude and longitude where the features could get a little bit muddier. So that's definitely something that we're looking to kind of build in as we evolve this tool. It's a friendlier interface to do some of that editing, but again, that's not in the current version. Check out Nicole's work; it's fantastic. I was really happy to help support her in this. And it's just a really examination of the evolution of religious politics in post-emancipation Virginia. And this website, which is here, mappingblackreligion.com, is kind of a companion. Sadly, as the COVID outbreak happened, we kind of had to put all of that on hold a little bit. So we're hopeful that now that there's at least some guidance for us about what the fall semester is going to look like, we can hop back into that and then pick up where we left off and continue our work there. And so in terms of the code, there are a couple things about this method that I'm not really happy with and are worth changing. Like one, I think as awesome as ACF is, these interfaces eventually kind of started to use. Down here, this points kind of feel the same way. So there may be some room for either using the Gutenberg interface in a better way to make some blocks that could do this in a fashion, but it's also very template driven, which I think also tends to get kind of messy when we write the front end JavaScript. So where I've gone since then, we had Geospatial tool right as the COVID outbreak kind of happened, and this was originally we were asked to make a prototype of what it would look like to create a website where we could crowdsource Wi-Fi hotspots to provide students who didn't have internet access with a way of getting internet access. So we would find public libraries and things like that had decent internet that we could throw out there to them as an option. The legal people squashed that because, as legal people do, they were very concerned with risk and what if somebody gets mugged in this library parking lot, which are all valid concerns, but it was kind of sad to watch this get made and then not go anywhere. But we took a totally different approach with this one, where this is essentially a single page application built with Vue, so the theme is just one index.php file that loads one div, and then the rest of our application is kind of injected into that. And all of the interaction we have with the back end is done through custom routes in the WordPress API. And so I've linked a blog post here where I kind of talk about my design choices when I was building this thing, because I think it's an interesting, and I don't know if it's totally headless. And so it's what I'm calling a hybrid headless, because it's not separated from the WordPress instance. It is very much still a WordPress theme. The assets are all served by WordPress. And obviously the data that we get is the data that we save, and the data that we retrieve is all generated by those custom API routes. So it's kind of an interesting way where, like, if you don't want a totally separate thing where, like, maybe like Gatsby or Nuxt would have to be hosted somewhere else and then only communicate through the WordPress API, we get this kind of hybrid approach where we can build a really high functioning SPA, single page application, but then still get all the benefits of being on the WordPress site, using the WordPress cookies for authentication and stuff like that. And so it kind of gives you a best of both worlds approach. So if you're looking into doing some headless stuff, definitely check out this blog post, because, like, for me, it solved a lot of problems that I was having when I was trying to separate them totally. And obviously there are concerns with that there's the separation of concerns benefit that you get by removing them entirely, but that also causes more problems, particularly with making authenticated requests to the REST API, having people log in and out, where this kind of seems to solve at least parts of those. So either way, I think this is the route that we're going to take with most of this stuff moving forward, is taking what we have and kind of saying, how do we rewrite this so that all of the data gets provided to us via the REST API, and all of our interactions with it are through that, because then it really just makes the front end code a lot easier to write. Because if you see, for example, this is a response that I get from the WordPress REST API, and so it's all very nicely formatted. I get it in the way that I want. When my front end JavaScript receives that response, I don't have to do a bunch of parsing to get to it, because since it's a custom route, I kind of control what that response looks like in a way that you don't get with the kind of built-in response you might get even if you have a custom post type that you expose through the REST API. So typically when I start talking about geospatial stuff in WordPress, people are like, why did you use WordPress? Why not IS, et cetera, et cetera. And all those are super valid concerns. And like I said, for some of the stuff, we still kind of needed to use ArcGIS. But for the short answer, I've got a couple of short answers here, and most of these are specific to our little group. Using WordPress gives us ownership of the tech stack for the projects we support. If we build something for somebody, chances are we're going to be the one answering an email if it breaks or it doesn't work. And the more we get out into vendor land, the less we have control over what's happening. And sometimes that's not great, especially when you're a team of 3 people and you have a lot of these things out there, that we all have a base level understanding of WordPress. We can all take apart a theme or a plugin. And so it's very easy for us to hop in or out of different projects just based on that familiarity. So, like, even though Jeff developed this, it would be trivial for Tom or Matt to go in and say, hey, I'm noticing this, somebody reported a bug, blah, blah, blah. It's also highly portable, like, Neatline and some of these other things in ArcGIS. Obviously, ArcGIS can cost a lot of money. VCU's lucky enough that there's some money allocated for that, but it's not a lot, and it's very difficult to get them to commit to what they'll support for one-off classes like this, where it's not a GIS class, it's a world studies class looking at gentrification. So it's very difficult to find the budget to kind of support some of that stuff. And then what I found is that WordPress is very easy to transport. So just like in that example I gave above, where Nicole and I started working on that project while she was a faculty member at VCU. She's since moved to Yale. It was really easy for us then to say, okay, hey, go get a hosting account with Reclaim Hosting for $15 a year. We'll export it all, and there you go. And then this can live wherever you want it to live, and then we can continue to work on it outside of a particular university's ecosystem. WordPress provides our team with internal continuity, which is something I kind of already mentioned above. It was very easy for us to bring people in and out of projects as long as that's our kind of base. And then finally, eventually standard, and this is just my experience working with a lot of faculty who are really experts at the research that they're doing and really have high bars for what they're going to put out there. Standard is just not enough for most people. They get to a point where something that we've done in one of these off-the-shelf kind of products, they're like, I don't like the way this looks, I don't like the way this feels, and I want to change it. And it's much easier for us to do that in a system where we have total control than it is to be like, all right, well, let me see if I can make this JavaScript shim that'll, hack in there and do all this other stuff that it was never meant to do. So that's kind of one of the benefits. But I say all that, and there have certainly, and some of those I'll kind of go through. Even though I think this has made the storytelling aspect of WordPress, of creating geospatial stuff, a little bit easier for some people, the process of collecting, cleaning, organizing, and transforming that geographic data is still really difficult. I mean, and that is part of just the game, I think, to some degree. And as the world becomes a little bit more data-centric, we're seeing that change where now, for example, I can go and I can get really good data sets in GeoJSON from the city of Richmond about their bus stops, about, you know, crime incidents of crime or bicycle accidents, all these really cool things. But before, in some cases, like, there is no choice but to take on that manual data munging work of getting everything in a usable format. So I'm really kind of like thinking about what role could WordPress play in that? Number one, does it make sense for it to play it? Number two, and then how do we do that, and what does that look like? The other struggle that I've had, and I kind of alluded to this when we were talking about the difference between the templated narrative scrollytelling example and then what we did where it was totally API generated. Sometimes the mapping of the post and custom fields to these custom objects gets a little cumbersome. And that's really, I think, solved by the API to some extent. It involves, like, obviously a little bit more PHP programming, because you've got to go in there, create the route. You've got to go and get the data from WordPress using its own conventions, transform that into JSON that you want. But I think that's a lot more tenable in terms of having the front end deal with those objects instead of what can sometimes become WordPress soup. Because it's just like, obviously, you know, the WordPress API responses are what they are, and they're super helpful for some things, but it's just an annoyance, I guess, when you're doing lots of development work, that I'd rather just say, this is what this object looks like, and I'll go back and like look at this one, for example, just say, this is what this looks like, that mental model in my head, instead of always having to say, how does WordPress treat this custom field? Where do I go to get at that? Or where would I go to, you know, what do I have to do to include that? Make sure that's included in the response. So there's some benefits to that method. And I think I'm finishing just 1 minute ahead of time. So maybe if we've got a few seconds, I don't know if it's worth taking Q&A here, or I'm happy to hop into those reply comments, and I'll make sure that I answer every question that anybody has.
Jeff, thank you so much. You are correct that we are about out of time. Fortunately for attendees and that have questions, y'all are welcome to use the Ask a Question tool on the session page, and Jeff can go and answer all those questions on the page itself. So that'll be great. Jeff, I just want to thank you so much for your presentation today and the information you provided. It was awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for tuning in.